Okay. Um, Thanks everyone for coming. This is me and Carly. Carly, do you want to go first?
Sure. So, hi everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for being here. This is our workshop. Organizers are workers to live your values, manage humanely, and win campaigns. This workshop is about learning to be a better manager who's effective while also staying true to our progressive values. And while we are primarily going to talk about management on campaigns, this is definitely applicable to other settings like nonprofits, unions, and values-based and mission-driven businesses. So if you're thinking to yourself, I'm not a campaigner, don't go anywhere. I think you'll still find a lot of stuff that'll be helpful to you. So to introduce ourselves, my name is Carly Stevenson, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I live in Indianapolis with my wonderful wife, our brother, 2 cats, and a very abnormally small English bulldog. I began my career as a union organizer, and then I moved into labor communications and have gone back and forth between political campaigns and labor and other issue-based organizing. I'm a 2-time Bernie alum, most recently serving as New Hampshire Deputy State Director and Communications Director, and I also managed the 2020 Indiana Coordinated Campaign after the primary. And now I work as an independent consultant, specializing in communications and values-based management training and leadership development. And I became interested in this and helping others to become a better manager after having so many bad managers myself.
And I'm Josh Rodriguez. I started my career path, I guess, as an intern on a labor union, and then I joined a state PAC down in Texas that specialized in reaching out to marginalized voices and registering them to vote and mobilizing them for electoral gains. And then I've worked on a couple of electoral campaigns. And currently, I am a digital strategist for a firm in DC, and I do this with Carly because, as she said, sometimes you get really fed up at having terrible managers, and that's why we're here.
Excellent. All right, so to kick us off, if anyone wants to join the chat, we want to talk first about what it means to be a manager. So if anyone wants to chime in, what does being a manager entail? Probably most of us have had some pretty terrible managers, but hopefully we've all had at least one really good manager. So if you feel moved to participate, just pop in the chat and let us know, what did that good manager do? What were they like? And if folks are feeling shy, I can say that one of the things that I always appreciated in managers that I've had that were good managers are people that I felt like they were very focused on problem solving. I never felt uncomfortable telling them when I had made a mistake or when something had gone wrong, because I knew that they were not going to yell at me or blame me. They were going to say, okay, let's go into problem solving mode and figure out how to get out of this mess that we've gotten ourselves into.
Some of the responses we've gotten below are like guiding, supporting, they're direct, they're transparent, they're caring, and they're coaching, which are all true, right? But
Absolutely.
do you want to go?
So the most important thing to know, so I think all of those suggestions are absolutely right, and we get into those later in the workshop and get into more detail on that. But in terms of being a good manager, the most important thing to know is that managing is contextual. A lot of management training programs and gurus, books that you'll read, they want to give you a one-size-fits-all strategy. They'll tell you, if you just use this philosophy or theory or form or set SMART goals, everything will fall into place. And that's just not true, because every campaign is different. Every staff is different and every situation is different. And one of the most difficult parts of being a manager is striking the right balance in each context. Human beings and the organizations that we create and work within are dynamic and they're changing all the time. So as managers, we have to be flexible and adaptive as well.
And managing is also communicating. A big part of managing is like setting forth clear expectations, uh, verbalizing problems and solutions for people, praising people or giving them like highlighting successes for them. Also, always relying job critical information and providing a lot of training, right? Um, that means that this sort of communication should be a two-way street. And good managers listen twice as much as they speak. It's not about just giving orders constantly to people and then hoping they figure it out on their own. You have to listen to their problems and help them solve their problems as they happen. And a big part of that is feedback, right? Like giving and receiving feedback. And the key to feedback is to remember that it's just a tool. It's never a personal attack. And that applies both when you're giving feedback and when you're receiving feedback. By focusing on ways that people can improve rather than what they're doing wrong, it makes the experience of both giving and receiving feedback so much more positive and so much more likely to like actually be taken in and acted on. Uh, when you're giving feedback as a manager, you have to remember to keep it specific and not make it overly broad. You want to make it easier for people to absorb the information and plot on how to make improvements to their actions, tasks, and behaviors instead of them believing it's a broad critique of them as a person. And you sort of get away from that by making your feedback extremely specific about the problems that have arisen. And you want to have those coaching conversations. Coaching came up a lot from the responses you guys saw. Um, and that means using technology for documentation escalation so that you can show people that like this is an actual conversation uh, taken step by step instead of like going from like, hey, do this to you did it extremely wrong. We need to talk about you maybe leaving the team. That's not how you should use technology. You should do steps and you should use technology to show them how this is a going and coming conversation. Uh, we also want to talk about coaching versus discipline, right? Coaching is very separate from discipline. A coaching conversation is a friendly conversation where you're talking to people about how to improve on the mistakes they've made, how to change certain behavior. Whereas discipline is someone's done something that falls outside of your ethical standards. And so that's a very different conversation. Um, in in coaching conversations, you want the person you're having the conversation to understand the desired outcome from that specific conversation. Uh, Before you do any of these conversations, what you really want to do is shadow them to understand what the problem is or like what the behavior that needs to be corrected is, instead of just relying on like other people to do that for you. You have to see it firsthand.
And I think the other thing that's important too with discipline conversations is no discipline conversation should ever be a surprise to anyone that you're managing. And no one should come into a conversation thinking that they're about to have a coaching conversation or a one-on-one conversation with you when actually you're about to have a discipline conversation. So that's something that you want to give people a heads up ahead of time, email saying, listen, we need to talk about this. This is going to be talking about progressive discipline versus we're coming in as a coach, because you want your direct reports to be prepared to have that conversation with you. It's not going to be productive for either one of you if they're totally blindsided about a disciplinary conversation.
So some of the management best practices that we came up with is never become a knowledge trap. As soon as you find information that's job uh, related, you should be passing it to the people that you are managing. You should also share what you know, and that means everything you know, right? Like you're training these people to eventually replace you. So it's extremely important for them to learn as much as they can from you while you have the opportunity to lead them. Carly?
And then another thing that is really important is a concept called extreme ownership, right? So you as a manager want to take extreme ownership. So what that really looks like is you don't ever want to be in a blaming mindset, right? You don't want to blame other people if you are thinking to yourself, well, I just have a bunch of bad organizers, or they don't listen to me, they don't do what I need them to do, rather than focusing externally on the ways that they are not living up to your standards. You should look at yourself first and think, okay, have I given them everything they need to do their job? Do they understand what their job is? Am I available to them? You want to run towards problems and not blame other people, and really look at what you can do to solve the situation. And when you model this, you create that culture for your team, right? So rather than having a culture of complacency, or people are afraid to say something when they know something is going wrong, because you're modeling that extreme ownership, your team hopefully will be modeling that as well, and will be proactive about solving problems and bringing issues to you. And another thing that's really, really important in terms of being a good values-based manager is to be flexible for human needs. So what that means is everyone on your team should be held to the same work standards, provided that they are doing the same work. You don't want to play favorites or let things slide with certain people. And you really want to check yourself to make sure that you're not doing things like that. But you want to be very, very flexible when it comes to things like being sick, having doctor and other appointments, caregiving responsibilities. Because when we don't give this type of flexibility, that's when burnout sets in. And that's also where we lose a lot of people from marginalized communities and less privileged backgrounds. And when we talk about like staff turnover and people don't stay on campaigns, they don't stay working for progressive organizations or nonprofits. When we're not flexible for people, this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because only a very small number of people can quote unquote handle the situation, and even those folks are struggling. And just to give an example of a way that I was flexible with someone that worked for me on the coordinated campaign, one of my organizers was a mom to two young children, and she came to me and said that she was really struggling with call time on Tuesday and Thursday nights, because she had to go pick up her kids from their babysitter right at 4 o'clock. Then she has to get them home. She's got to put dinner, chicken nuggets in the oven. Anyone who has kids, I'm sure, knows that young kids in particular have difficulty with transitions. So she was always struggling to get into call time, and she lost a lot of time, and therefore her numbers were not as good as her coworkers. But she was an excellent organizer, and when she could have the time, she was leading the pack. So what we did was we had her run our phone banks those 2 nights, because the phone bank started later than call time for recruiting volunteers for our field organizers. And then rather than running phone banks on Saturdays, which is typically what all of my organizers did, she actually did a lot more volunteer recruitment calls on Saturdays. So we were able to switch up the schedule and made it better for her, so she could take the time that she needed to focus on getting her kids squared away, and it didn't impact the team, and she was able to do her job. And the rest of the team was very willing to be flexible and help out with this, because they knew that this was my standard across the board. If someone needed some flexibility or accommodations for things in their personal life, we were doing that. And it's really important to remember that the kind of work that most of us do, it's very high intensity, right? So don't forget that all of your workers, and it sounds so simple, but you'd be surprised how many managers don't think of this. Don't forget that all of your workers, they need to do laundry. They need to go grocery shopping. They need to cook for themselves and clean their bathroom and hopefully get at least 6 hours of sleep every night, preferably 8. And if they have kids or other caregiving responsibilities, they have even more things to do. So remember that people don't live to work, right? Even with the types of work that we do that is based in our passions and our values, we all at the end of the day have lots of other things in our lives that we have to attend to. And so the next thing, and if we want to move over to the next slide, and this is really, really important. Not everyone is cut out to be an organizer or to work in a union or in, certain roles in nonprofits, but your job is to remove every barrier to organizing that you can. It's very, very popular among managers and leads on campaigns and in unions and other high intensity jobs in the movement to say things like, oh, they're just not cut out for this. And it sets up a dynamic where the manager, the organization, the leadership style, and the culture can't fail. They can only be failed. And when this is your attitude, not only do you lose many talented people along the way, you waste time and resources on turnover and training new organizers, but also very importantly, you shut out marginalized communities and people with diverse backgrounds and experiences. And it's attitudes like this that make older workers, people with kids, folks with disabilities to say things like, oh, working on a campaign, that's a young single guy's game. And we don't want just one type of person who's already very overly represented in campaigns and in progressive spaces to be the only ones who can succeed at these jobs. So one of the best ways to ensure success for yourself, your campaign, and your organizers is to hire the right people from the get-go. So we will open the chat back up. So how do you hire the right people? What are some strategies that folks have used to hire good people in the past? Nobody wants to hop in the chat.
Well, it's actually good that no one's in the chat, because this is actually a trick question. You can't just hire good people, right? There's actually a process that starts way before you hire. You have to be able to create structure, stay organized, especially when collaborating in the hiring process with multiple people. If you have to hire people across different departments, that whole process must be organized so that people are taking notes during interview, you're checking at least 2 references, and you're being purposeful when you're hiring. And you also want to try to recruit people who are there for the right reasons first, and prioritize creating an abundant, diverse candidate pool. And the reason I mention that is because it's extremely problematic when you, as a person, are tokenized, when you're hired specifically to meet some sort of demographic checkbox, right? And you also hire people that fit this demographic checkbox, but who aren't there because they like the work. They're just there because they've been tokenized, and it's the meaning to the campaign or any situation you're hiring in, and it's the meaning to the person that's getting hired, right? Because as a Hispanic person who didn't speak English until I turned 13, I've gotten hired on some campaigns simply because I was a Hispanic person who happened to like politics, but my views and the organization's views were diametrical to each other. But I checked I checked the box, so that's why they hired me, and it's demoralizing when you're a minority.
And just to pop into our chat here, Katie Ray Reek who is a wonderful consultant on culture, is running a whole training on how to hire people in doing just and culturally competent hiring tomorrow. So I highly recommend that everyone check out her training. So when you are doing purposeful hiring, you want to consider each applicant in the context of your team dynamic. So for me, whenever I'm hiring folks, I look at what kind of team do I want to create. And for myself, I like to hire, when it comes to hiring organizers, I like to hire a mix, if I can, of older and younger organizers, seasoned and new, people with different organizing backgrounds, campaigns, different skill sets. And one of the things that I have found in the context of especially political and electoral campaigns is people are very prejudiced against older organizers. They think that, oh, someone who's older or who has a child or who's retired, they don't want to make 200 phone calls a night asking people to volunteer for the campaign. So first of all, that's illegal to discriminate against people based on their age. But secondly, I have found that having people with different life experiences really brings an important viewpoint to your team. It's really good if you can have a couple of folks who are retired and have a lot of life experience and have worked in different jobs with your new, really passionate, energetic, excited college graduates, right? That, in my experience, putting folks together who are coming at those two things, bringing that youthful dynamic in with that age and experience, can be really, really helpful on putting together a great team. And that's just an example of, you really want to think about putting together a team that has different skills, right? And can work well together. So you don't want to have just 5 or 10 or 100 of the exact same person. That's not going to get you a great outcome in terms of what you want on your campaign. You want to be realistic when you do hiring. So a good example of this is, if you're hiring someone who has never done this before, they don't have any organizing experience, you have to be prepared to be a lot more hands-on with them. And you should really think about, do I have the time and the resources and the energy as a manager to put in all of the time and effort that I need to make sure this person is successful? If you are hiring for a campaign and it's going to be 3 months, you probably don't want to really hire anyone who's never done it before, if you can, because you're just not going to have the time to get people up to speed where you want them to be. And then you've put yourself and that person in a bad situation where they can't succeed. You want to be really purposeful when you hire. You don't hire a bunch of hotheads, right? Don't hire people who are all going to be constantly at odds with each other. If you are interviewing folks and it's like, wow, all these people seem like they have really strong personalities and they're going to butt heads and clash, as the person who's putting together that team, you want to think through, okay, how are these people going to actually work together? So it's not just about whether you like them or whether you think they would be a good fit for the organization. Are they going to be a good fit for each other, right? Other things that I like to think about and that Josh likes to think about is, when you're especially working on electoral campaigns, you want to hire a couple of really good van people that are good with technology. You want to have that person that you can go to say, all right, we've got this issue with van or with our tech. Can you help us out? I like to have a mix of people who are very intense and then also people that are very chill. And you want to hire at least one person who is really experienced and can check you, right? And who's not going to be, that you empower, and who's also not going to be afraid to say, hey, Carly, I don't know that this is the right call. You don't want to have people on your team that have such a big gap between where you are and where they are that that you're never wrong, that they don't feel like they can challenge you. That's not good for you, and that's not good for your organization. And another thing that's really important, and this is something that I learned the hard way as a manager once, is you really want to advocate to the people above you to hire your own team, because you're responsible for them and you have to want to protect and fight for your team. And I learned that what seemed like a good fit to me may not be a good fit for the person who is going to directly manage them. And when I actually was the deputy state director on Bernie in New Hampshire in 2020, I hired both of the deputy field directors for our field director. And one of them turned out to be really great and worked really well with the field director. And one of them was basically an issue for the field director for most of the campaign. And I think had I allowed my field director, had I cooled my jets, taken a step back and said, okay, here are some folks that I've looked at, I think they would be good candidates, and then handed them off to my field director to make the final decisions, I think they might have been able to have seen where they might have not have been a good fit with that deputy, and it would have saved us all a lot of heartache.
You also want to, when you're managing diverse teams, you want to understand your own blind spots before you start managing people. You want to always keep an eye out for microaggressions. You have to be very people you're managing and how certain things that might seem innocuous to other people will affect a specific member. You want to listen to your organizers when they're telling you any of the problems, right? Because they're the people closest. They're the people closest to the. They have their ear closest to the ground, so they can see problems that you not be able to see. And if you actually listen to people on the ground level, you can get around a lot of a lot of grief, like Carly mentioned before. And you always be putting people's safety first. When I organized in Texas, we organized in distinctly red counties, and so there was times where people's safety was put at risk. And so you want your organizers or anybody below you to be able to come up to you and tell you, like, I don't feel safe going into this neighborhood. I don't feel safe doing this. I don't feel safe doing that. You want to have that clear channel open so that people are never put in any sort of danger. And before you start managing people, you want to make sure you're culturally competent in general and that you are actively pursuing increasing your cultural competency. You don't want to have to learn how to deal with different people once you're managing them. You want to be able to do that before you get in a position of power. And I think you should never apply for a position of power over other people where you're responsible for them if you can't be competent with their culture. It's a very basic thing that like most of us would take for granted, but sometimes people don't. And so I think if you're ever in a position where you can help people reach that cultural competency, you should definitely go for it. What is managing up?
All right. So, managing up. This is very important because most of us are going to have, while we might be managing other people, we also have managers ourselves, right? So it's not just about managing down, it's about making sure that we are essentially organizing the people above us and getting what we need for our team. We do the next slide.
Yeah.
So this is the visual we like to use, right? You are the umbrella and all the little people below are your team. And your job is to be that barrier, right, between your team and the people above you and clear every obstacle out of the way so that they can do their job, right? You, in a campaign that Josh and I both worked on, there was a lot of dysfunction and toxicity and issues with our top manager, our state director. But fortunately, almost none of our organizers really knew the extent of the problem until after the campaign was over. And that is a testament to the field director, to people like Josh who were in that chain of command, that they were able to allow their organizers to just stay focused on what they needed to do and not get bogged down or worry about stuff that was happening 3 or 4 levels above them.
So managing up is advocating for your team, and it's pushing back on unrealistic expectations, whether that's on a field or communications or any sort of like facet of a campaign. Sometimes the people that are at the top forget how hard the work at the bottom of the structure is, and they will have these ridiculous expectations of what theoretically should be possible without ever taking into consideration, like we said, that like the organizers are humans and they need to sleep and they have life and work, right? Sometimes the people at the top forget that people don't live to work. And so you always have to be willing to push back on those things as soon as like they pop up, right? Like if someone's like, we should be hitting 10,000 doors with 20 people this weekend, you should be the first person to be like, that's not going to happen. It's impossible for that to happen. Like even if we worked ourselves to the bone, it wouldn't happen. And you can't be afraid of doing that. Like that's the position of a middle manager. You have to manage up and down. And you always want to be getting information and resources for you and your team, whether that's like actual physical resources or it's just information that they need in order to do their job well. And like we mentioned before, take extreme ownership. Don't wait until something goes wrong to make a plan for managing up. You should be taking extreme ownership of everything related to your program and your team, and that's all. That means taking ownership of like how you interact with the people above you.
So how do you avoid burnout? We want to move slides. So first of all, and this is really, really important, do not think that you are going to do a do as I say, not as I do model for your organizers. This is something that is really, really important because I know I'm the kind of person that I will say, okay, if my organizers couldn't get it done, I'll stay and I'll get it done, right? And that's a good instinct to have, but you want to be really careful with that because if your team who works underneath you sees you staying at the office until 10, 11 o'clock every night, I guarantee you, because of the power dynamic and because of the differential in your power versus their power, they will feel pressure or they will wonder, should I be staying at the office till 10 o'clock too? Right? So if you want your organizers to go home at 8 o'clock, you need to go home at 8 o'clock because they are going to listen so much more to what you do versus what you say. And I think this is a lot of managers think that they are sending the right message about this stuff, that they're approachable, but you have to remember that for someone working underneath you, you're responsible for their livelihood, right? You are responsible for whether or not they can pay their bills that month. So always be cognizant of that power that you have and really model what it is that you want to see from folks. So that means you have to learn to disengage. You can't take your work with you all the time. If you do, you will become extremely toxic. You won't mean to, but Josh and I have seen this time and time again where good people who really care about the work get so caught up in it that they were good leaders at one point and then they just become toxic to their entire team and their campaign over a period of time. So be really mindful of what you're doing to disengage yourself and encourage that healthy work-life balance in your staff. And this is so important. It is good for the movement. And I think that in the years that I've been involved in campaigning and organizing, I do think there's been a big change in the importance of self-care and work-life balance. Once upon a time, the only people who knew what self-care meant was when I was in college and I worked for the Rape Crisis Center on campus, we were the only people talking about self-care. But really, as a manager, you have an opportunity to encourage community care, right? It's not just about doing what you need to do for yourself, but also creating an environment where people, especially folks who are LGBTQ, BIPOC, people with disabilities, people who are maybe going to feel not as comfortable taking that space that they need for themselves, you are in a position to encourage them to say, yep, you got to take a break, take a break. Because ultimately it's good for our movement. We lose so many talented people because they get burned out or they have one really, really awful experience on a campaign and then they say, forget it. I am never working on a campaign again. And that is really to our detriment, not just on campaigns, but in unions, progressive nonprofits. I mean, I think we've lost thousands of years worth of experience and skill and excitement from people because we've burned them out.
It's a drain on institutional knowledge that's a big problem on the progressive spaces. Like, we constantly burn people out and it's to our detriment. It really hinders our ability to grow as a movement.
And one thing, and especially in the context of organizing, this is really important because most people, they don't stick around being a field organizer, right? Or being that kind of one-on-one, on the ground community organizer, right? They're like, okay, I gotta work my way up the chain. Now, I would never tell anyone, as someone who's worked up the chain myself, I would never tell anyone to not pursue opportunities for more growth, development, responsibility. But one of the reasons why so many people don't stick around as field organizers is because it is such a draining, burnout heavy job to have. And if we can make these jobs more life friendly, right? And a job that you do not just once to put it on your resume or to get to the next thing, but something that people really stick with and get better at. That's better for our movement. And there are a lot of people who really enjoy doing the field organizing, the one-on-one organizing, knocking on doors, but those jobs are so difficult to have long term that most people choose to try to move up the chain or go into a different aspect of campaigning.
Something that has happened recently in a lot of our progressive spaces is a lot of the workforce that we work with are unionized. So we have a couple of pointers on this. Read the fine print. If you're working with unionized staff, read the CVA. It spells out in detail the working conditions that organizers have agreed to, and it helps how you build out a program that conforms to the CVA. If you're working with non-unionized staff, read CVAs. They're a good way of gauging if you're asking too much of your staff. Reading them and having examples of them can serve as a guideline to create an equitable program where people have like that work-life balance that we've been talking about this whole presentation. And if you need an example of the CVA or you need examples of work schedules built to conform to for organizers or any other staff on a campaign, feel free to reach out to me and Carly. We have a lot of them. And we just want to hit this point again. Don't burn through your staff. It's bad for the movement. It scares people away from the work that we do, and it makes it really hard to keep any sort of institutional knowledge within these progressive spaces we work in. It's very hard it's costly and very hard to constantly find new people to organize and work in middle management and work in like the bottom of a structure when you're constantly burning through them. It sends a bad message to people that might be interested in this type of work. They won't be willing to come into it if they see that everybody that works here always badmouth it afterwards. It's just it's just something I really want to stress. Don't burn through your staff. There's ways of making this work equitable, rewarding that work without having to put people in really tough spaces.
And don't lionize the hard charging campaign staffer, right? Every campaign has that one guy that smokes like a chimney, and not to call out too many organizers, a lot of organizers smoke, but every campaign has that one guy that's like talks like this, and he's like, I've been doing this for 20 years, and like, he like smokes 3 packs a day and sleeps 4 hours a night and exists on like gin and tonics and like beef jerky. And what I've noticed, and I say this as much about myself as anybody else, is that we tend to lionize those types of figures, right? They almost become larger than life, especially in unions and campaigns. And I would just encourage all of us to really take a step back and check ourselves and think that there's more than one model to being a successful organizer or a successful campaigner. And a lot of people that are really toxic and frankly don't even have the management skills that they need end up getting these jobs because they look the part, right? And they fulfill these stereotypes and these archetypes and expectations that we have of what a campaign operative looks like or what an organizer looks like. And it's really, really important to, check those biases that we have in ourselves, not just from the perspective of being diverse and inclusive and ensuring that everyone feels like they have a place in your movement, but also just in work style as well. We're not going to, if we are not going to improve the situation and improve workplaces and make them more equitable and more sustainable and professionalized, if we keep sort of putting up on a pedestal the types of managers that frankly make this type of work very difficult, but that's all that we really see or know, or we admire and we sort of weirdly admire and are also kind of intimidated by these sort of larger than life characters.
So we're doing the key takeaways for the presentation. Be aware of yourself and your team. Know your team dynamics and spend time with team members individually. Know your own biases and blind spots and actively work to improve them. That talks to the cultural competency requirement we were talking about. Communication is key. Communicate proactively and adapt communication contextually. Put intentional communication structures in place and stick to them. If you're having one-on-ones every week, then they should be every week, and that's how like you'll receive a lot of feedback from your organizers. Have different ways of communicating with them so that it's not just you having one-on-ones every week. Be free to communicate with you through email or text every single day when a problem arises or they have a question. And hire a team you want to protect. You're responsible for building, training, advocating for your team. And sometimes that includes removing a team member that is not working out.
And one thing, we didn't get into this too much, but when it comes to having to remove someone from your team, that is, in our experience, the best way to have that conversation is, first of all, that's why you make sure that you're doing those progressive steps, that progressive discipline, because when the time comes, if someone really is just not working out, it's not a good fit, that should never be a surprise to them. Obviously, there are situations where you have to remove someone immediately, things like sexual harassment, racism, any kind of extreme toxicity. Josh and I are firm believers in zero tolerance on that stuff.
There's some red line issues that like require for immediate removal, and that's a
Right.
different conversation. But
Right.
if you're firing someone because they're not performing, it shouldn't be a surprise to them at all.
Right, exactly. And also on that point, when you hire your team, you should be very clear about what your expectations are in terms of how they are going to treat each other and the respect that they have for one another, and making sure that you have a safe, non-toxic, equitable work environment. And you want to really stress that and hit that home from day one, and also make sure that people know that they can come to you if they see something that is not right. If they see someone saying things that are racist, or harassing someone, whether it's volunteers, other organizers, and you also need to make sure that they know that if for some reason they don't feel comfortable coming to you, who are other people in the structure that they can go to. And that's something that's really important. I just want to hit on this, especially on campaigns. The structure is really important. You don't want people jumping steps, but when it comes to things like sexual harassment, racism, workplace toxicity, you should make it very clear to your staff that they can tell anybody in their chain about that, right? Anybody that they feel comfortable with, they absolutely can skip you and go to your manager if they see something like that. Because, and if you don't send that message to your organizers, it sets up a dynamic where you are gatekeeping on things that are creating potentially a hazardous environment for your staff. So that's something that I just want to be really clear about, that I think is really important. And again, when you have to remove someone for performance-based issues, that shouldn't be a surprise. And we really encourage people that we work with to try to do the best you can for them. If it's possible to give them a severance payout, or give them a couple of weeks to finish up a project or start looking for other jobs. Remember, you're not trying to punish them as a person, right? And most folks who are really, really struggling and it just like is not working, on some level they will be relieved, right? But again, you have to remember, this is their livelihood, right? You're making a decision that now they're not sure where that next paycheck is coming from. So we advocate for folks, if you have to remove someone for performance-based reasons, advocate to enable them to be able to collect unemployment. Don't fight it if they apply for it, and really give them as much space as you can. So give them a few weeks if like to find another job if you can. Give them severance if they need to be removed right away. Just because you have to remove someone from your team does not mean that you should stop advocating for them, unless they're toxic or abusive and they're doing something wrong. But if it's really just a question of their heart was in it, but it just is not clicking, you shouldn't stop advocating for them just because they have to leave your team. Advocate for them to leave the team with as much of a cushion as possible, so that even though this wasn't the right fit for them, they are having as much of a positive experience, positive to neutral experience, that they can have as they're leaving your campaign or organization.
And this is part of that extreme ownership. You recruited this person into this specific job role, so you're responsible for them landing on their feet afterwards. Especially especially when it's a performance issue. When it's something different, it obviously becomes way more complicated, and that has to be resolved in other ways. But that's our presentation. Are there any questions?
Let's see. Oh, I see a. Oh, thanks, guys. And we can move this over to the next slide.
Wait, there's a question.
Oh, yes. What if it's on the line between performance and harm? That is a great question. I would say that,
If it's, in my opinion, if it's in any way harmful towards any other staff member or the volunteers, then it's just about it being harmful, right? Like once someone crosses that one of those red lines, even if there was performance issues before or anything like that, once someone crosses into being a noxious person for someone, then it's just about that. That's just how I would solve it. But there
okay,
is a
yeah. And
discussion
I'm
to be
saying, like, the person is not able to do their job and it's causing harm. So I would say in that, to piggyback off what Josh was saying, in that situation, I think, to the extent that you can isolate that person from the team as soon as possible. And I think, for me, it's like an ethical thing. If someone is harassing someone, right, I'm not going to worry about whether or not they land on their feet, right? But if it is someone that's like they're not able to do their job, it's causing harm to the team, but it's not a it's like, I would say at that point, you need to remove them from the team as soon as possible, but then still do those other things to try to help them land on their feet. So for me, the difference is if I find out that someone is harassing someone, and I mean, I've had to fire several people for this over the course of my career. That person goes, and I'm just like, you're gone, done, you should really think about what you did here and change your life. But if it's someone who is, they're not able to do job, but it is causing that harm, I would say treat it with the same urgency that the person who is harassing someone, being racist, doing something toxic. But then see, after you've removed them from that team and they are no longer harming the rest of your team, how can you help them kind of land on their feet and find something to that's going to be a better fit for them. What do you do if two team members just don't get along? That's a great question. I think a couple things. I think that is really, that's another one of those things. It's very contextual, depending upon the size of your team. If you are working on a campaign like a statewide campaign, when Josh and I were on Bernie 2020, if two team members didn't get along, we had a lot of opportunity to see if one of them was interested in maybe moving to a different region, or working on a different part of it, right? Maybe moving over to campus organizing versus regular organizing, and just trying to remove those folks from each other, because that's the kind of thing that definitely can have an impact on your entire team. And then I think that if it is something where you can't remove them from like the little team or pod that they're on, you need to have some pretty hard conversations with them about how, and come up with a plan of like how they are going to ensure that the fact that they don't get along and they don't like each other doesn't impact the team. But Josh, do you want to hit more on that?
Yeah, I think it depends on like why they don't get along, right? Like if one of them is, I don't know, a Dallas Cowboys fan, and one of them is whoever the Dallas Cowboys play. I don't really know sports. And that's why they don't get along, then that's an easy conversation to have with them where they have to check those sort of things at the door while they're working. But if it's something much more complex, then I agree with Carly. Like you either try to move them around in the team so they don't face each other as much, or sometimes you have to have a tough conversation with one of them about like maybe this isn't somewhere you want to work. Um, we're running into the last 5 minutes of our allotted time. So if you want to do or learn more, we're here to help. Contact me or Carly. Here's our emails. Feel free to, whether it's that CVA example you need, or you have some of these questions that are just more complex and we don't have time to solve right now, feel free to reach out to us.
And we do also, this is our passion project, and we do offer consulting and coaching to folks. So if you, we're happy to talk to anybody, but if you do want to go more in depth on any of these things, we would love to work with you and your organization. And let me see if I can answer a couple of these things. We've got our 5-minute warning. I agree, Elizabeth, that you're absolutely right. Many organizations, the red flags come from the top. So I think that's why Josh and I do the work that we do. I think that's why Katie Ray Reek does the work that she does with building culture is, I think, being out there, and that's why we do these trainings, is to really try to change the culture and put out there into the ether that these things are very important. And I think that speaking from my, oh, go ahead, Josh.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Speaking from my experience, this doesn't always work, but often when it comes from the director level, you have to focus on what they care about. And a lot of times what they care about is like the nickel and diming, right? How does this impact the organization? So what I often do when I'm struggling with someone above me who doesn't seem to care about the things that I care about is try to hit the liability aspect of it, that like you don't want your workers to go to the press and say that you were forcing them to work 70 hours a week, right? And I think reminding them that with the way that the media ecosystem works now with social media, people are a lot more able to get their stories out there and to spill the tea about what's going on in their campaign or their organization. And reporters they love those stories, right? So sometimes if you can't appeal to their values, I think appeal to like, listen, you don't want this bad publicity, or you don't want us to get sued, or you don't want donors to question whether or not we can whether or not they're going to continue to fund us. And also, if you are running the humane values-based structure, keep really good records, right? Keep really good data, because you want to be able to go back and say, listen, I've been working my organizers 40 hours a week, and this is what we've been able to accomplish. And we're doing just as much, if not more, as the team that is working them 60, 70 hours a week. So be ready and prepared to defend your tactics, right? And then the final thing here, what can we do as a movement to help create better overall humane values and hold ours and other organizations to those standards?
I think
so. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think in this one, it's key to work collectively with other people. And so always be reaching out to other people in order to do this work collectively. We have a 1-minute warning, and I really want to say thank you to everybody that came. Thank you for any feedback that you can get back to us. And yeah,
And
I don't want to run over the minute.
We love talking this. Like I said, this is our passion project. We love talking about these things and exploring these things more. So please, please, please write down our emails, take a screenshot. You can call me, text me, and we would love to talk more with folks. And if there's anyone or organization that we can help out with this stuff, please reach out. And I encourage all of you to attend Katie Ray Reek's training tomorrow about equitable hiring.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.